Welcome to part 2 of Trojan Adventuring Party's 4-part DM workshop. Today we will be discussing how to run social encounters for beginners. Particularly, we'll be discussing how to do them without having to rely on signature character voices. There has been a lot of emphasis in recent years, partially due to the incredible talents of people on Critical Role, which is the most popular D&D media at present, on focusing your social encounters, particularly as a DM, around a certain voice for particular characters. And I'd like to cover the ways to run a social encounter that surround that, so that even if you don't feel particularly skilled with a voice, even if you don't feel particularly confident in your abilities as an actor, as a DM, you still know how to run those compelling story scenes. So we'll start with intention going into a social encounter. You should know a couple of things before your party steps into a social encounter, whether that's a talk with a merchant or a confrontation with a king and a gathered council looking down on your party as they give high-stakes information that could result in either their lives being spared or being executed. The first thing you should know is the tone of the social encounter, and you should generally come back to that tone. This isn't to say that the tone shouldn't deviate throughout the social encounter. There are plenty of film and media where you have these scenes that are very, very serious, and then there's a lighthearted moment, and then they come back. And the coming back to the tone for the beginning and the ending of the scene is very important. And when I say coming back to the tone at the ending of the scene, that does not mean that the tone can't change throughout the scene. Sometimes a drastic shift in tone is necessary to create a compelling scene. For instance, if you have that aura of suspense as you're encountering a king and council that might threaten your players' lives, but then at a midpoint, some piece of information is revealed, and they're all buddy-buddy, and there's a release of tension there, and the scene probably ends soon after that. But either way, you want to know your tone heading into a scene, and what the through line of that tone will be, and you want to maintain that. NPCs in a threatening situation will be threatening, etc. The next thing that you want to know as part of the intention of a social encounter is what the best and worst thing that can happen are. You see sometimes on the internet things about, oh, well, the bard with an expertise in deception rolled a nat 20 against the king when telling him, actually, I'm the true king, and so now I get to take your kingdom. And there's complaints about that and a sense that new DMs feel they have to abide by that nat 20 or that nat 1, etc. Technically, skill checks don't have a critical success or a critical failure, but the point remains. If you get an incredibly high result or an incredibly low result, you should not do the best thing that can possibly happen for the players or the worst thing that can possibly happen for the players. You should do the best thing that can possibly happen for the scene as the upper limit. For instance, if you are on the execution block, you are not going to necessarily talk your way all the way out of it. You might talk your way into creating a distraction, and that might be the absolute upper limit best case scenario. Likewise, if you are in a scenario with a friendly NPC who does not particularly mean people a lot of harm, there's not a lot of ways that a situation could go wrong here First off, you want to consider whether you want to have your players roll at all in that kind of scenario. But second off, you don't want the bottom threshold of any scene. Whenever you make this abides for checks as well as player roleplay. You don't want an abrasive action or a low check to derail your entire game. So you should have a sense of what the bottom limit, the worst possible thing that can happen for your story in this moment is, and the best thing. Speaking of friendly NPCs and kings and so forth, you want to have a sense of what your NPC's intention is. If you are worried about presenting yourself well enough as an actor to portray an NPC, if you are worried that you don't have the training or skill or the voice for it, here is the basic workaround so that you don't really have to do all of that. All of that is nice. It's great flair. If you can do that, great. You don't have to for the story to work. For the story to work, all you need is for an NPC to have a consistent goal and a way that they are trying to achieve the goal. Maybe they want money and they want to do it by intimidation. That's all you need. That simple goal and tactic can get you through every NPC that you make. And sometimes those tactics change. For instance, if the intimidation isn't working, either the social encounter should resolve itself once the intimidation doesn't work. Maybe the person runs away with their tail between or walks away with their tail between their legs, or maybe a fight breaks out. Either way, the social encounter is resolved. It's bookended. Or the person shifts tactics. They move on to a more bargaining kind of thing, or they reveal a new hand that they haven't played. Therefore, keeping the same tactic, but changing the stakes a little bit. Or going into the honeyed words persuasion kind of thing, changing the tactic. That'll get you through most NPCs that you want to make. And it'll be rewarding for your players because you'll have varied social encounters, because you'll have varied intentions and varied tactics that the NPCs are taking. In general, there should be a reason they want to talk to the player. Even if they're just stopped on the street, the reason they're talking is out of politeness. And you can play that politeness and that desire to stop talking to the player so that they can move on with their normal day as the tactic and the intention. The other thing about NPCs is that, particularly for more experienced DMs, particularly for DMs who do have that flair and that voice and that attention to the dramatics, there is a temptation to overplay your NPCs and to make them the stars of the scene. One thing to remember at all times is that your player characters are the protagonists of the story. You can have interesting NPCs, but they play off of your player characters. There are some small exceptions to this, but they should not happen all the time. A big discussion where the player character's input doesn't really matter can be a powerful thing if it is very, very rare. Seeing like a discussion between two high up people on the council deciding their fate or deciding the fate of a nation, that can be engaging as long as it's not, okay, great, the DM is talking to themselves for a long time again. you always want to have your PCs be the protagonists, and you want to have them as involved with the scene as possible. As many people wanting their opinion and speaking directly to them or having intentions against or for them as possible. And this kind of bridges the gap over to handling PC roleplay. Because naturally at any table, you're going to have players that are very comfortable role-playing, and occasionally you will have players who are too comfortable role-playing, to the point where they're overshining other players, and you will have shy players in all likelihood. If you're playing with a very, very experienced group, maybe you don't have shy players, but in all likelihood, there will be, in most D&D games, there is a new person who is, at least one, who is nervous, reticent to show off a character voice or to really get involved with the role play part of it. They just kind of want to sit back and feel the game. But you want to involve them in a certain degree to show them that if they are interested in the role play angle, you are creating an avenue for them. So handling a player that may be too loud at the table, or not even too loud, just going in the wrong direction sometimes. Sometimes you can have fantastic role players who are just, they've interpreted the scene wrong, and they're going a direction that you don't want with it. And in that case, reprimands are always fine. I find for diplomacy and for getting along with your players and just signaling to the players that what they are doing roleplay wise is not quite the right thing here or is a little bit too much here, I find an NPC reprimand doesn't have that same level. It's two levels of disconnect because it's not you directly telling the player, hey, you're being obnoxious right now. It's you, through an NPC, telling their character, which then transfers to them, that maybe the character is being a little bit too much right now. That gives a sort of gentle reprimand to the player, even if it's a harsh reprimand to the character. So I've found that to be effective. They don't even have to be out and out. The NPC says that the PC is annoying. It can be reminders of their station. It can be reminders of the protocol of the place. Something short, something quick, to the point. It should get most people who are on the same wavelength as you to just snap into the right mindset. Of course, past there's always the edge case, people who are not self-aware about what they are doing. And that won't as much be solved by a simple NPC reprimand. But maybe talking to them in a gentle way outside of the game, maybe later in private, because nobody wants to be reprimanded in public and they're likely to dig in their heels even more. A conversation that just says, hey, I get that you like the roleplay angle, but I am trying to involve Alice more. She has seemed a little hesitant on the roleplay, and so if you could just maybe push her towards the center a little bit. We're trying to, that kind of thing. That kind of not making it personal, just kind of saying, hey, you are heavy on the role play, and I'd like someone else to have the chance, because that's predominantly what you want. In terms of handling players that are quiet, it's kind of like having a conversation in real life when you're DMing a social encounter. When you're having a conversation in real life, you always kind of want to give people in the conversation equal attention. You want to make people feel good by just kind of working your way around the circle. And naturally, you'll give some people a little bit more attention than others, depending on the situation and who you're close to and all kinds of context. And people will understand that. But you always want to kind of, give a little uh, comment over to some person or to ask for another person's input. That same thing applies when you're DMing. You should be keeping a track and a meter, a vague meter of who has been talking the most and who has been talking the least. And you should attempt to involve people who are a little bit less involved. You can do this as a player too. You can approach other PCs that don't that haven't necessarily been speaking up a lot. You can ask people about their backstories, stuff like that. But as a DM, it's important to have NPCs, which ultimately you will encounter more of. It's not always put on your players to involve every single PC, but you as the dungeon master have a certain responsibility to drive the story with other people in the world. So you can do things like out and out have the NPC ask for the quiet person's opinion, address their quietness, ask what they want from a situation. You can have them, you can build a social encounter where there is a stake that the player character, the quiet player character has in it, or that the NPCs believes that they have in it, or there can be a topic that's related to that character's history or their class or some other part of their identity that it would make natural sense for that player to be involved, and your NPCs address them as such. In general, for encouraging quiet players, I have found it's nice to be encouraging with NPCs. And I don't, when I say this, I don't mean that the NPCs are nice to them all of the time and give them plenty of compliments. Maybe a couple of nice NPCs here and there are always good. You never want everybody to hate your players over and over and over again. It gets tiresome and it makes it feel to them like you hate them. What I mean more, rather than playing constantly nice NPCs to one quiet player in order to get them into the roleplay, what I mean more is engineer situations where they can look or feel good at first. That kind of, okay, this person is important in this particular situation, and everybody looks to them as an important person, and their words have weight, and their actions have weight. Have NPCs who like or dislike certain unique elements of the player character. Have those be addressed because that gives a little bit of prodding forward, a little bit of encouragement of just giving a unique personality to play up a little bit of the personality of the PC. You can just give little jabs to the side here and there to say to that player, to address that player and say to that player, hey, if you want to role play right now, that's all right. You don't have to. But like they're addressing this part of you, so if you want to, you know. So that's how to handle loud and quiet players. That's how to handle the intention of a scene. That's how to handle the intention of an NPC. However, having all of these personal elements to it that you can absolutely manage is not the only part of Dungeons and Dragons. And charisma, deception, intimidation, performance, all of these are skills in the game that your characters can be more or less skilled in. And as such, sometimes it will come down to a dice roll. Knowing when to adjudicate skill checks is more difficult in social situations than it is in most other situations in the game, because they can turn the tide in so many different ways. The first thing to know is when to shut down or not offer a skill check. If an outcome is a certainty, then there shouldn't be a skill check involved. If they are certain to be successful, they shouldn't roll a skill check, because there's a possibility they'll fail, and you as the DM will have to be like, no, actually a 2 succeeds. And there is a possibility that when they are assured to fail, that they will, roll a 19 or a 20 or something like a deception check well into the 30s. And then you will have to compensate for that. You shouldn't have them roll ability checks just because they ask to, or you feel like you should have more social ability checks. You should roll ability checks when there's a chance that something will happen socially. If your players are, for instance, actively trying to deceive a guard, and there is a chance that they will all be taken to prison, and there is a chance they will be let scot-free, that is a great point for a deception check. Less of a great point for a deception check is when, say, a noblewoman NPC has said, I will give you 300 gold pieces to go kill all of these goblins, and one of your players says, what about 5,000 gold pieces? You don't put a check in front of them there, because it's not a possibility. Knowing when to adjudicate checks is partially based on knowing when it's okay for your scene to change in a particular direction. And a lot of it is player initiated. If a player steps forward and puts forward an idea that might change the scene, a new avenue to go down, and you think that, okay, this could work. I could change a couple of things, and this could potentially work, but I also have plans involved where this doesn't work, or this isn't a possibility. Then you call for a skill check. You got to have that idea of where your story can adapt to the player character's agency. And once you have that idea, once you have, and the idea is having forking paths. Even if you eventually need to lead back to the same point as though you're going linearly, you can split off from it and do it in different ways. And knowing that is a big part of knowing when to adjudicate social skill checks. Involved, finally, in social skill checks. And in all of this eventually is resolving the social encounter. Oftentimes, the skill check brings the encounter generally to a close. Once the skill check is successful or unsuccessful, if there has been a skill check at all, you know the direction the social encounter is going, and there need to be just a little bit of pleasantries to make sense that we're not cutting away right now. Resolving a social encounter can be difficult to tell. It's like resolving a combat encounter. There's no strict rules of when things stop. You can, of course, bookend it with a goodbye, goodbye kind of thing, but you never know exactly where to end it and how long to keep going. The idea that I normally follow is you end the social encounter as a success or a failure. And they don't need to be extreme, ecstatic, everything in the player character's life has changed, successes, and they don't need to be abysmal, Dark Night of the Soul style failures. But there needs to be something that they were trying to achieve that either succeeded or led to a next step to something that might succeed or was a failure. Um, knowing once there is a success or failure, you should wrap up the scene fairly quickly, because otherwise it looks like there's time for negotiation when in reality your players have already negotiated, your players have already made the skill checks or the arguments or said the words that they're going to say, and the result has been decided upon. So you wrap up the social encounter quickly after that. NPCs leaving is always a good way to do it, or asking the players to leave, something direct that signals, okay, the social encounter is over now. In general, players will find it unsatisfying if everything is just status quo at the end of the social encounter. Particularly, I say this because there is that controlling DM instinct to be like, no, no, go away, go away. The social encounter is over. You stop right now, and to maintain the status quo, because the status quo is what works for your story at this moment. Having the idea of the success or the failure and ending swiftly after that helps you maintain the flow of the game, and it makes it feel to your players as though their role play choices are having real effects in the world. Okay, fantastic. That is the end of Trojan Adventuring Party's Part 2 DM Workshop, How to Run Social Encounters for Beginners. I hope that you enjoyed this workshop and look forward to more DM workshops in the future, as well as other workshops coming from Trojan Adventuring Party.